It's a great pleasure to have Guy Bunin here with us from MIT. Guy did his undergraduate studies at Jerusalem University. He studied physics and math. And then he moved to the Technion for his master's and a PhD, which he did with Dov Levin and then Yariv Kafri. And after that, a couple of years ago, he moved to MIT, and he had the prestigious Pappalardo Fellowship there. And today, Guy will tell us a bit about polymers. We got those of you who were at the Statistical Mechanics Day about a week ago. You got some taste of this nice subject involving statistical mechanics, knot theory, and polymer melts. And we'll be glad to hear more about it today. So thank you, Guy.
So yes, let me start by saying that most of what I'll be talking about is joint work with Meir and Kardar at MIT. And depending on time, I'll try to say a few words about the other work with my fellow postdocs, Adam Nahum and Pablo Serna. So the problem I want to discuss is simple enough to at least present on the very first slide. So polymers are microscopic strings, and here's another string. And the question is, suppose we take this string, it's extended, it's in some state, and now we quickly compress it, cram it to a small ball. And the question is, what is the crumpled state immediately after this compression, after this quench? And of course, that would depend on the dynamics, but that question is still one that one can ask. And the first thing to note, actually, is that let's see if I find the ends here. If I try to open it, it unknots very easily. Okay, so it is an unknotted state when it's crammed like this. Okay, and it's not just unknotted. In fact, here's another unknotted state. I can take this thing and perform this, small knot here. This is also unknotted, but in some sense, I have a harder time opening this state here. And so, really, in some sense, this crumpled state is very unknotted. It's unknotted on all scales. That will be one of the points. And okay, so in order to understand this better, you already see the relation to topological effects in these dense polymeric systems. Dense systems meaning that every point is sort of touching a lot of other points around it. It's not floating freely. So here's the first phenomena that we would like to use in what happens later. Imagine that you take a bunch of these polymers, linear strings, and you put them all together in a dense collection known as a melt. And now you let this wiggle around, equilibrate, relax. And after a long time, you look, and this is what you see. This is a result of simulations. And you see that it's a highly entangled, highly knotted state in the sense that, for example, if you try to pull out one of these strands, you will probably have a very hard time doing that. And on the other hand, if you take now, instead of these open strings, you take loops. You take closed strings like this. You take many of them, all of them in this simple unknotted topology, and they're unlinked. You can pull them apart if you like. And now you put them all together in this, again, dense collection. You let it equilibrate for a long time. And what you see, it's a bit hard to see here with the colors, but they're much, much more segregated. They try to hide from each other. They are much less entangled than here. Okay? And first of all, this is a very interesting problem on its own right. Here, the constraints are these topological constraints. They're maintained because the polymers cannot pass through each other. So the topology is maintained in all future dynamics. But these are non-local constraints. And somehow you see even locally that the conformations look very different from this state here. OK. Just an idea, a rough idea. This is, of course, not a solid argument of where this segregation might come from. Imagine that you have two of these polymers sitting on top of each other in independent configurations. They are most likely to be linked. Just two random say, two closed random walks will probably give you a linked configuration. You will not be able to separate them. On the other hand, if they sit in less overlapping states, they have a much greater probability of being unlinked. And now you want to condition yourself, to constrain yourself to only being unlinked, as you see here. And so there's much more entropy here. There's many more configurations here when they're less overlapping. So there's something like an entropic force pushing us towards segregation.
Simply what you mean by linked. Initially they are unlinked. You put them together, they somehow tangle.
So what I mean is that topologically, you can change what they do, but you're not allowed. Two of them are not allowed to pass through each other, and so that's almost by definition the idea that you can continuously change the state.
So in the end, you say you do find them linked?
No. The dynamics here. The dynamics here is such that the topology is maintained all the time, and therefore topologically they are by definition not linked. And so here what you want to do is only to sample configurations that are not linked, and therefore the claim is that geometrically now you will see them more segregated. Okay?
What does probably linked?
This means that if you sample them independently, you will find that they are linked. And if you put them, which means that most of the phase space here is phase space where they are topologically linked, if you put them independently one on top of the other. On the other hand, if you put them independently but with some less overlap, you find them unlinked.
Then they will be linked.
Yes, topologically they will be linked. Okay. Okay. The second, yes.
Excuse me. I understand that the finite dimensions of the straight make that you never get an homogeneous situation. But do all the places
Inside the melt, you mean?
Yeah. Here, take two arbitrary, I don't know what they're not, to the left, upper left.
Mm-hmm.
Do they get ultimately every position?
Yes. So I'm sorry. The picture here is actually open. It's unwrapped periodic boundary conditions. Okay. The density here is very uniform. It's very, very uniform. Yeah. It just looks like that because it's opened in order to show what's inside. Okay. Yes. Okay. So sorry. So the second point that we want to use later is a dynamical one. And the idea is that if you have dense regions, if you have a polymer that's in this dense state, or many polymers in a dense state, the relaxation times are very long. The relaxation is very slow. And the reason is that for relaxation, what you need is for the ends to start moving around, and they need to drag the entire polymer after them. That's a slow process known as reptation. The spell checker kept correcting this to reputation. No, it's reptation. Okay, and that's a slow process. So as soon as you're dense, things happen much more slowly, and in the timescales of condensation might even look like it's frozen. Okay, so these two elements play together in a range of phenomena. So first of all, if in this class of problems where you only care about the final equilibrium conformations, we already discussed this segregation in the ring melt. Our contribution to this class is to suggest that if you look at a melt of directed polymers that are extended in some preferred direction, both simulations and numerics would be, and analytics would be much easier, perhaps. And we are seriously, what you get here really challenges ideas in the field. I hope to talk about it again in the last few minutes. But really, let's talk about the other case now, where you have this mixture of these topological effects, but with dynamics, with rapid compression of your system. And beyond the, let's say, academic curiosity of these problems, which I find very interesting, there are quite a few applications these days, perhaps most prominently to biology, specifically to packing of DNA in the cell's nucleus. And this comes in two different scales. on the smaller scale, a single DNA strand is packed in a way which has been shown to be related to this crumpled state in experiments, and I'll show some data and how it's related later. And on a larger scale, different chromosomes, namely different DNA strands, are packed inside the nucleus in a relatively segregated way. These are results of experiments. And this is claimed at least to be related to these polymer melts that we discussed before. And really, if there's one, my favorite insight from this field in the last few years is this finding that in many cases, DNA is packed in an unknotted structure inside the nucleus. And now that we say that, you can really imagine that this could have many, very important biological function. For example, if you try to pull something out in order to read it. Okay? So this is really a very nice development in the field in the last few years. In addition, these polymer melts have, these ring melts, for example, have interesting mechanical, rheological properties, very low resistance to shear. In the class of directed polymers that I mentioned before, we find polymer brushes that are anchored in one at the bottom, and so at least in some states tend to have this garden variety picture, and of course vortex lines in superconductors. And finally, the physics Ig Nobel for 2008 was awarded to a group that studied why is it that cords of earphones always get entangled when they're in your bag and you always have to unknot them. So I guess really my demonstrations should have been with earphones, but okay, that's what I had. So okay, so back to the question that we want to discuss. You again crumple this thing and ask what is the crumpled state immediately after the quench. And the first thing we already can say is that that is a well-defined question because subsequent rearrangements will take much longer times. Okay, that's what we said before. So already we know that at least we can ask the question. There's a timescale separation. And here's the picture that people have in mind. This is actually from an old, now classic paper from the late 80s. Here's the picture. So you start compressing this thing, this string, and what happens? Different points along the polymer start condensing. There are these more dense, irregular shapes along the polymer. These are known as blobs, just to indicate that there's some irregular shape along the polymer. And as you continue compressing, these blobs meet, collide, and form bigger blobs, which then collide to form bigger blobs, and so on and so forth. And now, here enter our two phenomena that we described before. So if we have these two different blobs and they meet, remember, they're not independent polymers. They don't have their ends. Their ends are connected to the rest of the string. So the claim is that these unlinked elements, when they come together, they remain segregated. So the identity of smaller blobs inside a bigger blob is maintained. And in addition, once you are compressed and crammed, you are more or less frozen. You don't keep rearranging inside very much. And now to this, and okay, this separation is something that I'm making. It wasn't really like this in the original paper, but I think it will help us in what follows. There's something that is a slightly separate issue. And the idea is as follows. As you continue with this picture, these blobs keep forming and growing. But the claim is that really the polymer looks more or less the same, at least statistically, with one difference, that there's a tube whose thickness keeps growing with time. Okay, so it's like the original polymer, but decorated, if you like, by a thick tube. Okay, so really at all times we see more or less the same picture. And here's the illustration from the original paper. You have these blobs, and because of the identity that is maintained, every blob has smaller blobs inside, smaller blobs, this hierarchical picture. And because at all scales, once these blobs collide, they make a bigger blob, and so on and so forth. In the same way, we have a fractal final structure. Okay? We have a self-similar final structure of the blob inside, and therefore of the final state here. Okay? So that is the claim, that is the picture. We get a fractal structure on all scales. It looks the same. It looks self-similar.
being in some heat bath with some temperature?
Yes, so I'll define exact dynamics later, but for example, you can imagine that it is floating and then there's force, external force acting on the monomers, on the different pieces of string, and they all pull it in at the same time, okay? I'll give exact dynamics in what comes later. Okay, but first let's see what this fractal or self-similar picture would give us in terms of something we can measure. And the claim is as follows, or the simplest thing that you could measure is you take 2 points that are a distance m along the polymer, and you measure their physical distance inside this final structure. And because of the self-similar structure, we expect this to hold, we expect a power law relation between these two quantities, and because it's a dense structure over all scales, you can even show that the power is exactly 1/3 in 3 dimensions. And indeed, in simulations, you see that this fractal globule is different from the equilibrium final state. It's very different. You see a plot of this R versus M looks different. This is the fractal. This is the equilibrium in blue. And what people imagine in their minds is something like a 3-dimensional version of this piano curve. And this is the, one of the covers of Science saying fractal DNA. So this is what you want to have in mind. And even here, as I promised, these are very, very recent results. This should be published in Nature every day, any day now, of, again, the same R versus M in fluorescence, super resolution fluorescence microscopy imaging of segments of DNA inside nucleus of cells. And you see, okay, it's only over a bit more than a decade, but you see quite a clean power law with more or less the exponent that you expect. Okay, beautiful. Everything fits together, a beautiful picture. Just one small cloud in the horizon.
Well, why is it called a fractal if it's just the ordinary density of matter in 3 dimensions?
Oh, it's not about the density. It's about how the end-to-end distance scales with the distance along the polymer. So in an equilibrium globule, you expect that what you would do is, this is what you see here, you would do something like a random walk through the system. You would hit the wall of the globule, and you would do another random walk and another one. And so you get 2 different exponents. You get a 1/2 that saturates. That's the equilibrium state. And the fractal state, you don't see it clear here, and we'll understand why later. You expect a single power law to go through the entire system with a 1/3.
If I have small molecules in a volume of radius r, and I have n small molecules, n goes like r cubed.
Definitely, definitely. It's the, but it's the.
What is the fractalness of, how is the fractalness of this expressed if the exponent is the same as ordinary matter?
No, it's not about the growth of, it's not about how the entire, the density is constant. So you take larger and larger polymers, and indeed the density is constant, and the radius grows as the length of the polymer to 1/3, which is the volume. That is true. But there is another issue, which is how far you go if you take 2 points, how far in the distance as a function of the distance along the polymer. Okay? Yeah. So that's a different observable. Okay. So everything is wonderful except one small thing. Ever since these ideas have gotten this renewed attention in this DNA, in the context of DNA conformations, people have been running larger and larger and larger and larger simulations. These are the same R versus M for simulations of size 250,000 monomers. These are very, very large simulations. This is this expected power law, and you don't quite see it agree with this expected power law. Okay, it's almost the same, but it's not quite the same. And this is kind of strange because in other polymer conformations that we know, random walks, self-avoiding walks, and so on, you see very clean agreements with power laws for even 1,000 or 2,000 monomer long conformations. And so this is actually kind of strange. And so there's a lot of discussion in the literature. I need even to update. There's 3 more new papers. The main object of discussion is whether these polymer theory ideas of segregation, freezing, and so on, whether they are indeed correct in this case. And we want to give a very different perspective, a very different reasoning that has to do with the dynamics of collapse. What I told you about the tube picture, maybe that picture is not quite the right picture. But, and I will now introduce our model how to separate variables and start studying things separately. Yes?
Where does self-avoidance enter into these considerations, or it doesn't enter at all?
I mean, first of all, self-avoidance is what sets the final density of the thing. And it also enters the combination of self-avoidance and the fact that it is a polymer, that it's attached, is what at the end enters through the topology, right? I mean, you want things not to cross, and also the fact that when it's like this and it has a hard time going through and mixing, that is also related and relies on self-avoidance. Yes? Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the problem in the self-similar argument, it only works in the intermediate ranges, right? At the edges, it shouldn't work anyway.
Right, right. I agree completely. Okay, so here you have three different sizes, and yeah, there's a nice collapse with some small finite size effects here, but you don't even see an intermediate range. There's not even, it's 250,000 monomers. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, and there's not even one clean decade where you see this aligned with the final state. And I know it might not seem strange to you now, but if you try a self-avoiding walk or a random walk with the same rules of the game, you would find very quickly that there is a significant range of orders of magnitude where it does hold very cleanly. I'm not saying that there isn't scaling. I'm saying that it's not clear what's going on here. Okay, so just from a broad, let's zoom out for a second. So the fact that this final state might be a fractal in its own is, we know of other fractals in polymer physics. We know of random walks. We know of self-avoiding walks. That on its own is the less interesting point. To me, what is interesting is that you take one self-similar state, say a random walk, you crush it, you crumple it, you just do something very rough, and you get another one of these fractal states with a different fractal dimension. And it's like this guy, the caption of this thing said he's not happy with his paycheck, so he takes his paycheck, which is this Sierpinski gasket, and he crams it, and he gets another beautiful origami thing. There's something here. It's an interesting question. What is going on? Under what conditions it would work, and so on.
Can you say what exactly crumpling means?
Yes, compression. Yes, I will give the next slide. Thank you. The next slide will be exact definition of the dynamics I will use. Okay, so here's our plan of attack. We want to introduce a model that will separate these polymeric effects, from the issue of self-similarity with this thickening tube. And the bottom line, I'm telling you what will happen at the end. We will argue that, at least for this problem, you can use quite safely these effects, but the self-similarity with the thickening tube picture is actually much more subtle, and sometimes you can get tubes of very highly varying thickness, polydispersed blobs of very different sizes, collisions of different parts, and so on and so forth. So this is really the subtle issue in this picture. And here is the definition of the dynamics of the full polymer with which we are going to work, and we're going to compare them with a simpler model that I will introduce. But here are the full dynamics, which will be our anchor, what we will go back to. So first of all, I need to tell you what the initial conditions for the compression are. The initial conditions are any polymer state, but let's look at three common examples. One is a random walk. This thing performs a random walk as a function of its length. The other is a self-avoiding walk. A self-avoiding walk, if I haven't said yet, is where you're not allowed to sit too close to yourself. And the third case is what I call one-dimensional initial conditions, where it's stretched with a bit of noise along the polymer, so it's not a one-dimensional lattice. And what are the dynamics? We will take perhaps the simplest possible full polymer dynamics. You have compression, which is a harmonic trap, together with connections between nearest neighbor points, together with self-avoidance, which we mentioned before, and all this in a completely overdamped regime so that the velocity is proportional to the force. Okay, so these are rules of the game.
R is the distance in this equation. R is the distance of
It's
element I from some origin.
exactly, precisely. Yes, thank you.
Crumpling is the first term. Is the word.
Exactly, this compression term. This is it, exactly. Okay, and
Realistic? I mean, is this what happens when you crumple?
well, it depends on how you crumple it, but really the idea is to look at the very simplest thing, to have at least the least amount of things that could interfere with your scaling, really to try to give it the best shot at scaling. Okay, so here's our model.
Is there any temperature here?
So yeah, so you could add noise, but the whole time for the compression is of order log of the system size. It's very, very fast, and so really temperature would be irrelevant for this process. And yeah, okay, it really doesn't enter at all. So it's really
So you have this string, and every element is sort of attracted to the origin with a constant force.
exactly, and in fact. No, not constant, sorry, harmonic trap, of course, constant, spring constant. And in fact, this is very much like a uniform compression of space, right? Because the distance between any 2 points is also compressed at the same rate, okay? So it's uniform compression of space.
Can you just go back one slide, please?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So this has one term which you explained and two more terms which are that one will be the neighbor interaction between.
Right,
And the third one is separable.
right. They don't sit on top of each other, right?
There's some assumption here that the system is somewhat elastic in the sense that there's a uniform compression of space and that it doesn't propagate in from the boundaries, because that's where the force
Right,
is,
right.
and slowly go in. That's sort of like like a sound wave.
Right. No, but you see, all these things would, I think, even worsen the situation. We really want the simplest possible dynamics that would look self-similar as much as possible on all scales, and that's why we use them.
But by doing that, you're building in the self-similarity. Maybe really what happens is that the forces first operate on the boundaries and then propagate in.
Excellent. So if here we're not going to find self-similarity, then definitely there's some issue. Okay, that's the point. Give it its best shot. That's the point. Okay, here's okay. Finally, here's our model for this whole problem. It's a much simpler model, as you will immediately see. What we want is a drop coalescence model. So we have points. We have the monomers are initially small drops. And the idea is that instead of a blob, we now have a spherical drop. So at least we know what we're talking about when we're talking about these blobs. We now talk about drops, spherical drops. And okay, like I said, they're arranged along the polymer. They're pushed in by the compression forces, the same compression forces. But now, every time two of them touch, they immediately coalesce to make a bigger drop. Okay? It's very much like if you have on mirror in your shower and there's water condensing on it, and every time two drops touch, they coalesce and make a bigger drop. Okay? That is all this is. So you take this polymer picture and you make it into these drops moving in and coalescing. Nothing else, no other forces in the game. That's it. And here's, just to make this crystal clear, here's a small toy example. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 monomers arranged on a polymer. And here they are compressed. And here 2 and 3 coalesce to make a drop. And now these two are touching and they coalesce, make a bigger drop, and so on and so forth. Okay, very simple. So,
there's no polymer there, right?
right, there's not even, right, the idea is that it's a compression dominated regime. You're even throwing away the tensions between them. And so, okay, so this is very simple, but remember what we were after. We were after the internal state, right? We were after the configuration of the polymer inside this big drop that we're left with. I'm sorry, I didn't mention all the coalescence conserves volume, of course. So we have this one big drop. It's the right size, but we don't know anything inside. So now we need to add the crucial additional element, and that element is as follows. And here enter really these topological ideas crucially. The idea is that what happens if you have two monomers, monomer I and monomer J, and they're sitting inside two blobs of some size. And these blobs meet for the first time, and now I and J are in the same blob. The distance between them reflects the size of the drops upon contact. That's the idea. Okay? And what is the distance exactly? We don't know. And nor are we going to try to get it in great detail. We're going to estimate the distance, give an distance estimate by something of the order of the new blob drop size here. That's all. So we assign a distance between these things the first time they are in the same drop of the order of this, let's say, the radius. Okay? Now you could play with different distributions of, give it a random number and with some distribution. These things do not change anything in the final results I'll be discussing. Okay, and the other important thing is, remember, when these things are dense, they don't move around very much. So we freeze everything subsequently. That's it. You assign a distance and you're done. Okay? Here's again a simple example. 2 and 3 meet. They're in a drop of volume 2 now. You get between pair 2, 3 gets a 2 to 1/3. And then 1 meets with 2 and 1 meets with 3. It's in a volume 3 to 1/3, and so on and so forth. You keep filling this matrix until you have all the distance estimates. That is the game. That is the name of the game. Okay, just so you get some idea of what the snapshots of the dynamics look like, here's the full polymer random walk, 15,000, I think, monomers. The two dynamics which we discussed. Here it is after some time. These are the full polymer molecular dynamic simulations. This is the coalescence model. Let me remove the shading. So this is now down to 300 drops or so. This is at a later time down to 60 drops. Okay? So this is what the snapshots look like. I'm just showing you the dynamics so far. Yes?
In this blob model, there is no self-avoidance and there is no springs. Right?
The self-avoidance comes into the fact that the volume is conserved. So if you have two blobs of volume V1 and V2.
When they touch, they don't, there's no force between.
Right. But the tension is dropped from this model. That's an important thing, yes.
And also there are no little strings which you have.
No, the strings are exactly in this freezing of everything, the internal thing. That's the idea.
So these things move. So from one picture you go to another picture.
Yes.
And there is some dynamics.
Yes, the dynamics is the compression dynamics that gets them together.
Thing that you take
That's
into
the
account.
four.
Right.
These 2 points that belong to a particular drop
Mm-hmm.
in one generation, that distance remains fixed.
Exactly.
But then when this drop coalesces with another one, then the relative distances now go by the different radius.
Right. But the
And
two.
you build some fractal property into the model.
Beautiful. So if, again, come to the same point. If I'm doing everything to try to make it this self-similar structure, if it doesn't work, then there's really something going on here. Okay? I'm giving it its best shot. Yes. Would you imagine that something could go wrong? Who would ever imagine? Okay. So let's see now the results that we're really after of the internal structure, right? That's what we were really after. So these are the full polymer simulations of 3 sizes here. And I'm plotting again, I want the distance along the polymer the physical distance between points average over all pairs that are the same distance along the polymer. And it turns out that there's a nice collapse of the large scale structure if we divide this distance by the polymer length, and we divide this physical distance by the average over all pairs for each thing separately. You see this beautiful collapse here. Here are the small size effects, finite size effects that are different at different sizes. Okay. These are the results of the coalescence model. No fitting parameters. It sits one on top of the other. It's as good as it could be because there's even less of the finite size effects at the very bottom. Okay, this is actually better than I hoped for and better than I need. But it's always beautiful to see something like this. Yes.
What is the cost for the short range retouch? The attraction is clearly something like 2 dipoles or so. But what is the reason for the short-range repulsion? You have no spins.
Right. So the reason that we don't have these, this is of order of, say, 7 or 10 monomers. The reason that here they go down is because they really have to attach. The nearest neighbors really have to attach. And here they don't really have to do that. So you're jumping to the long range already.
Refer to the figure to the right.
Oh, here? No, this is just the definitions. This is not a, yeah, this is just to explain what is M and R so everyone remembers, and I won't talk with my own symbols. Okay, great. So what does this mean? So yeah, it supports I think it supports these inputs from polymer theory, these freezing and segregation ideas, at least as they enter into this game here. And now we really want to work with the drop coalescence model on its own right and see what it gives us. So okay, so again, just to recap, we took this problem and made it into this drop coalescence problem. It seems to support these ideas from polymer theory. So now what we want to ask is about self-similarity. Okay? And here is the exponent, the famous exponent, the 1/3 exponent put on the same graph. And again, okay, this is not 250,000 monomers. This is 25,000 monomers, and we tried 50,000, and we tried 100,000. You again do not get a clean agreement with the expected power law. Okay? It sort of seems like it sort of gets sort of close to it, but it doesn't really fit. Okay? So the issue here is still there. Okay? And so now we want to understand this better. So first of all, the first thing first observation, you do very careful analysis of finite size scaling and so on. I won't get into it. Both for the molecular dynamics and for the coalescence model, what you see is that the more condensed the initial conditions you are starting with, the more of a scaling violation you get in the final dense structure. Okay, that's just a result, an empirical result. And okay, and now we go back to the original question. Why did we expect self-similarity to begin with? Why? Because we claimed, again, that if you have this initial polymer and the polymer in later and later times, it's the same picture statistically except with a thickening tube. I keep saying that. Or in the drop coalescence model, it's the same statistical picture but with larger and larger drops, right? That's the volume scale. And so at the very least, you would need that the distribution of volumes of these different drops would be a collapsing function only of the volume divided by some typical volume, which is time dependent. Okay? You want a collapse of all the distributions. And here's what we really get. We get that there are two regimes. So one of them we call the sequential collisions regime. An example of this regime is drops exemplified by the one-dimensional initial conditions. You start with something that's straight, and it keeps condensing, and you see the drops here. And the first thing you see is that more or less all the drops in the distribution are, in a bounded, more or less of the same order of magnitude of volume. The smallest and the biggest drop are of order of 3, a factor of 3 between the smallest and biggest drop. On the other hand, there's another regime, and the example is the random walk initial conditions, where there is a very, very wide distribution of drop sizes. Okay, it's highly polydispersed. This is a log-log plot, and you see that there's this diverging tail of many, many tiny drops in the system that are still there when there are also huge drops at the same time. And moreover, these things collapse very easily. The sequential collisions regime collapses very easily. Here you see a violation of scaling until very, very late times. Sorry?
What's the different colors?
Thank you. The different colors are different times. You take the distribution of drop sizes, just the bare distribution at different times, and you try to collapse it by dividing by some volume. Here you can do it easily. Here you have a very hard time. Okay, so that's the point. So now, okay, good. And now that we know that, I want to show you again just the snapshots and show you that now that we know what we're looking for, we can see it just with our bare eyes. The one-dimensional initial conditions, as I said, all the drops are more or less the same size, a bit larger, a bit smaller. Look at the random walk initial conditions. You see these planets or stars or I don't know, huge drops in the system along with tiny drops floating around in different places. And now, sorry, and the self-avoiding walk is somewhere in the middle. And now we can look back at the full polymer simulations. Okay, this is the original problem we want to look at. And you can see that here you can more or less imagine that there's a tube. But here in the random walk initial conditions, you see these huge clouds that take up maybe a finite fraction of the system, along with areas where your polymer is completely extended. You see the bare polymer with your eyes at the same time. So goodbye tube picture. Okay, it's a highly, many scales, microscopic scales, huge scales, all together in the same picture. Okay, so that is what happens here. For some reason, that remains with us until very late times, or at least until very big things already develop. Okay, so in order to understand these two regimes, we have two different analytical approximate descriptions for what happens in both cases. I'm not going to get into the details here, but the idea is in the sequential collisions, you really need a geometric theory which tells you how far nearest neighbor drops are, how they collide, what the sizes are after collision, and so on. It's really a geometric picture. And this is our, again, approximate theory that we give for the distribution. The important thing for us is not to exactly capture this distribution. That is not the point. The important thing is to see that first of all, there are no very small or very large drops in this system. It's a bounded distribution. And moreover, we can see that the scaling is very clean in this case. Okay? The collapses are very clean. And the reason that the distribution is bounded is because there's a negative feedback. When you have these two drops and they meet and make a bigger drop, they leave gaps on both sides. And these gaps take time to collide with the next drops again. And so this thing cannot grow until the gaps close. Okay, so that's the point. In the other extreme, we have these drops running around in all directions and meeting each other. Let's do mean field collisions. Let's use what's known as the Smoluchowski equation, which says, okay, what is the rate of collision of drops of volume V1 and V2 into a bigger drop? Well, it's the number of drops of one size times the number of drops of volume V2 times some function, some kernel, which depends on V1 and V2. We don't know what it is. It's some kernel. So now we want to know what this would give us. And one thing we could have done is played around with different heuristic choices for this kernel and see what happens and so on. But it turns out that something very clean and elegant comes into play here. We know from arguments which I won't get into that the volume, the typical volume, has to grow exponentially in time. And that makes sense because the whole process ends in a log of system size time. You know, it's exponential compression to the middle. So the typical volume has to grow exponentially. We even know this prefactor here. And from theories of Smoluchowski equation, which have been around since 1916, I think, we know that all scaling solutions, all functions of the collapse, have in fact this diverging tail. This diverging tail of many small volumes is there always when the typical volume grows exponentially. It's always there. And moreover, and more importantly for us, it's documented in the literature that in some sense there is a slow approach to the scaling solution, in the sense that this tail of very small volumes slowly changes its slope. To the best of my knowledge, and the knowledge of everyone I've talked with, this is not a well-understood phenomenon mathematically. It's a mean field equation, but still people don't understand what is really meant by a slow approach to scaling. Is it a large additional time scale? Is it some subleading term that decays slowly? No one really understands. At least we are part of a bigger question that is not understood. This doesn't show very well. Okay, just to say, I haven't said anything about coalescence systems, really drops that coalesce. Okay, it turns out that the main issues that we are tackling here are the central issues, or some of the central issues in really systems of drops that coalesce. And you see, in some cases, you have these monodisperse, more or less all drops are of the same size. In other cases, you exactly have these similar things where some drops are very large and others are tiny. So this is part of a whole literature in that subject. Okay, so how am I with time? Okay, so just to sum up and close this part here, we got these two different regimes. I've described them with some detail. The self-avoiding walk initial conditions, which are supposedly arguably the most interesting ones because that's what you have polymers sitting in a solution would be self-avoiding, seem to sit right on some transition between these two regimes. Okay, that's an observation. We don't understand it enough to say if this is really the case. Okay, so just to summarize this part, and you'll tell me if I have a few minutes or not. So we suggest this drop coalescence model to model the collapse of a polymer and to try to shed light on these problem with scaling of the final structure. And we find that there are these two different regimes depending on initial conditions. And we sort of have these analytical, at least approximation understanding of where the problems might come from. In one regime, the microscopic scales appear to persist until very long times. And of course, there's so much more to do, more systematic theory here, and a better understanding of the slow approach to scaling, which is something that seems to be part of a much bigger and perhaps more mathematical problem. How much time? 7 minutes? Okay, so I'll be very brief, and I just want to give you a sample of a different issue which is actually closely related. The point is this. Remember that at the start I told you the story about how rings in a melt segregate and don't mix with each other, and people were sort of skeptical here, and I completely understand your grievances. And the point is that these pictures look good, but when you really look at details of simulations, you find that there are very subtle issues there. For example, the surface area, how many monomers are touching other parts of the system, that is a very, very large number. It's almost all of them. There's very large surface areas and other subtle things. And all this, and there's no good theory for this, really. I mean, and it's hard to make bigger and bigger simulations because dynamics are very slow. And all this, the main point is that all this is part of a much bigger issue. That in that equilibrium polymer states, dense polymer states are quite well understood when you allow all configurations in the system. But despite a really long history of dealing with these topological constrained systems, there's a lack of a theoretical framework. Everything that people do involves uncontrolled approximations. And the real issue here is that the one that people in hard condensed matter also are very familiar with, that the question of topology, these are by definition non-local constraints. If these three strands, you ask, are they linked? Are they part of a link configuration? Well, there's no way of knowing without seeing the whole picture. Okay, so a lack of theoretical framework here is a real issue. What we suggest is a very simple model for topological effects, a fully interacting many polymer model for topological effects. The idea is that you have these polymers that are anchored at the bottom and the top. They are directed. They can only move upwards, but they can move to the right or left, and they cross each other. And there's a crucial distinction between crossing above and crossing below. Okay? And these guys are reminded by one of their models, and we can talk about that later. And the point is to sample configurations that can be deformed continuously to the trivial configuration. And so here's many body topology right there. Monte Carlo moves, which, because of relations to braid group theory, I won't get into that, are in some sense complete. This is a snapshot of a part of the system. The point is that now you can really test what happens and confront it with confront theories with these models. And so what's an example of the state-of-the-art theory in this field? You want to know what this polymer is doing. If there's a lot of other polymers around, you freeze the other polymers, and moreover, you replace what all the other polymers are doing with a lattice. So in 2 dimensions, here are points. This polymer can wiggle through, but you have to be able to pull it out without crossing any of these black points. In our model, it's straight rods with one polymer sort of wiggling around between them, and again, it cannot be linked with these rods. You should be able to pull it out without crossing the rods. Analytically solvable. We get that the height, that the transverse displacement, how much this thing wanders at half the height, scales as the height to 1/4. And what we get here in our thing, again, I won't get into the details, we get something that's closer to a log displacement. Much, much, much qualitatively different results from what we get from the exactly solvable models. So the best current theories are very wrong on these results. Is you freeze everything except one that's moving around, and the background is straight. And here it's really numerics of the full thing. Everything is moving around and wiggling. Many body, everyone's moving. Okay? And you look at the effective exponent, it's clearly not a 1/4. That theory is really ruled out. And okay, I won't talk about complexity. Complexity is low, dynamics are slow, everything is against the theories in the field. Just the intuition where this comes from, and I'll close. Here are these straight strands. But now let's imagine the two strands can cross. The background strands, the fixed strands can cross. Let's cross once. And now you have a third white strand that's wiggling through this thing. What do you have to do up here? What does it have to do up here to not be entangled with this cross here? This is the simplest thing it has to do. You see, it's quite complicated. Just because these crossed once, this has to do quite a complicated thing. And more crucially, if I had 3 or more black background strands, and they would do k moves here, the white would have to do e to the k, would have to do exponentially many moves. So if you wander away, you pay exponentially dearly for what the background has done when you're away once you come back. Okay? So that's the reason for the exponential suppression and getting these very small wanderings of the strands. They really try to hide from each other. Okay. I'll leave you with this video of me trying to pull through and showing you that this really is topologically trivial. I'll just say that, okay, this is just a testbed model for theories in the field. And as you can see, it gives quite surprising results. There are simpler models that might help us understand what goes on here. And yeah, that's it. I should close here. Thank you. Exactly.
And the other is the local dynamics. Is that true?
That's precise. In the local dynamics, once it has condensed, it features through these effective freezing and segregation, which we assume for the distances inside the dense drops once they have formed. Precise, yeah.
So here you show the one-dimensional lattice of these strings. What happens if you go to higher dimension?
Yeah, it's great. Wait, sorry, are you talking about this? Or
in this last demo.
Oh, in this last one. We don't know yet. We're running simulations now. It seems to be highly dense and highly compressed. It should go to at least 2 + 1. Yeah, 2 + 1 is interesting because those are polymer brushes. It's yes, definitely. Thank you. Yeah.
Once blobs start growing larger and larger, it seems to me that the dynamics of when two blobs collide, the amount of rearrangements that you need to make a larger blob is much, much larger. So the kinetics should slow down considerably once two blobs that are large collide and form a new one. You're assuming an instantaneous rearrangement. Isn't that, if you relax that, perhaps you'll get different statistics?
So, yes, we tested these questions to some length. The point is that really the compression forces that we use here are so strong that you actually see things rearranging very fast. And maybe an additional hint to why that happens is that remember that the blobs inside are not knotted, are this unknotted thing that is actually relatively easy to compress, to smear around. We said that these things have very low resistance to shear, for example. So it seems in a more liquidy phase than you would expect for such a system. But you're right that that is something that we should have that we have worried about. Yes.